The candle flame bent and wavered before Beatrice Rothwell's tired eyes as she pressed her quill to parchment. Her fingers cramped from hours of careful transcription in the dusty room above the San Andreas General Store in the New Mexico Territory, and she wondered how many more nights like this she could endure before the strain broke her completely. It was 1878, and the small mining town nestled in the mountains had become her unlikely refuge after her father's wagon train had been attacked by outlaws 2 years prior. She had been 19 then, barely more than a girl, clutching the few books she had managed to save from the flames. Now, at 21, she survived by copying documents for the townsfolk who needed legal papers, letters, or wanted their own precious books duplicated. The work was meticulous and the pay meager, but it kept her fed and housed in this cramped room where the walls seemed to press closer each day. The candle sputtered, drawing her attention to how low it had burned. She had perhaps another hour of light if she was lucky, and she still had 3 more pages to complete of the medical text Dr. Harrison had commissioned. Her eyes ached, and she pressed the heels of her palms against them, feeling the gritty exhaustion that never quite left her anymore. A knock at the door startled her from her stupor. Visitors were rare, especially this late in the evening when decent folks had retired to their homes. She rose carefully, her skirts rustling in the silence, and approached the door with caution. "Miss Rothwell." The voice was male, unfamiliar, with a slight drawl that marked him as someone who had spent considerable time on the range. "Who's asking?" She called back, keeping her hand near the small knife she kept on her writing table. "Name's Isaac Xerxes, madam. I run cattle through these parts. Mr. Harrison at the doctor's office said you might be able to help me with some reading." Beatrice hesitated, then opened the door a crack. The man standing in the dim hallway was tall, perhaps 24 or 25, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His hat was in his hands, and his brown eyes held an earnest quality that immediately put her somewhat at ease. He wore typical cowboy attire, dusty from travel, but his clothes were well-maintained and clean. "I can read for you if that's what you need," she said carefully, "though the hour is late." "I can see that, and I apologize for the intrusion," Isaac said, his voice gentle. "But I just rode in from 3 weeks on the trail, and I have some documents that need attention. I can pay, of course." Beatrice studied him for a moment longer, then opened the door wider. She had learned to trust her instincts about people in her time alone, and something about this cowboy felt safe. "Come in, then." Isaac entered the small room, and she immediately felt conscious of how shabby it must appear to an outsider. The single candle cast more shadows than light, illuminating the stacks of papers, the few precious books on her makeshift shelf, and the narrow bed in the corner. Her writing table dominated the space, covered with quills, ink bottles, and her current work. "You work by a single candle?" Isaac asked, surprise evident in his voice. "Candles cost money, Mr. Xerxes," Beatrice replied, moving back to her chair. "And I have little enough of that. Now, what did you need read?" He pulled some folded papers from his jacket, but his attention remained on the guttering candle. "How do you manage? Your eyes must suffer something fierce." "I manage because I must," she said, extending her hand for the documents. "The reading," Isaac handed them over, but she could see something working behind his eyes, some thought forming. The papers were contracts related to a cattle sale, and she read them aloud clearly, explaining the terms as she went. When she finished, he paid her twice what she usually charged, despite her protests. "You've saved me from potentially signing away more than I should," he said firmly. "It's worth every cent." He paused at the door, looking back at her small workspace. Miss Rothwell, would you object if I return tomorrow? I have more business that might require your services. I work most days, she replied. You know where to find me. After he left, Beatrice returned to her copying but found her concentration fractured. The cowboy had looked at her workspace with something like concern, and she was not accustomed to such consideration from strangers. Most people saw her as a tool, a service to be purchased, nothing more. The next afternoon, Isaac appeared again, this time carrying a large bundle wrapped in brown paper. Beatrice was in the middle of transcribing a land deed, her fingers already tired from the morning's work. "Mr. Xerxes," she greeted him, setting down her quill. "More contracts." "Not exactly," he said, and there was something almost sheepish in his expression. "I was wondering if you might help me with something of a more personal nature." He unwrapped the bundle to reveal 3 books, their leather covers worn but intact. "These belong to my mother," he explained. "She passed when I was young and my father before I learned to read properly. I've been carrying these with me for years, but I never mastered the skill beyond the basics. I was hoping you might teach me, or at least read them to me so I can finally know what she treasured." Beatrice felt something tighten in her chest. She reached out and touched the top book gently. "Poetry," she observed. "Wordsworth. Your mother had excellent taste." "Will you help me?" Isaac asked, and the vulnerability in his voice was unexpected. "Yes," she found herself saying. "But I should warn you, my rates for teaching are the same as my copying work." "That's more than fair," he agreed immediately. Thus began an arrangement that would change both their lives. Isaac came 3 times a week in the late afternoon, after his work was done, and before Beatrice lost herself in the long night hours of copying. They would sit at her small table, and she would teach him to recognize words, to sound out phrases, to understand the construction of sentences. He was an attentive student, patient with himself when he struggled and genuinely delighted when he succeeded. During these sessions, Beatrice learned about Isaac's life. He had been working cattle since he was 14, after both his parents died of fever. He had built a modest ranch about 10 miles from San Andreas, running a small herd with the help of 2 hired hands. He was honest and hardworking, saving his money with some greater purpose in mind, though he did not say what. "Why did you never learn to read?" Beatrice asked one afternoon as they worked through a passage from his mother's poetry book. Isaac was quiet for a moment, his finger tracing the words on the page. "Never seemed to have time," he said finally, "and I suppose I was ashamed. A grown man who can't read his own contracts, his own correspondence. I've been taken advantage of more than once because of it." "There's no shame in not knowing something," Beatrice said firmly, "only in refusing to learn when given the chance." He looked up at her then, really looked at her, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks. "You're a good teacher, Miss Rothwell, patient. I appreciate that." "You're a good student," she replied, ducking her head to hide her reaction. As the weeks passed, Beatrice found herself looking forward to Isaac's visits with an anticipation that had nothing to do with the money he paid. He brought life into her small, dim room. He told her stories of the range, of ornery cattle and wild horses, of sunrises over the mountains that painted the whole world gold. In return, she shared her own story, about the wagon train, about her father's dream of reaching California, about the night everything had gone wrong. "I was hiding in the supply wagon," she told him one evening as the sun set outside her small window. "My father made me hide whenever there was any sign of danger. I heard everything. The shouting, the gunfire. When it was over and the outlaws had gone, I came out to find everyone dead or dying. My father among them." Isaac reached across the table and took her hand. The gesture was simple, but it steadied her. "I'm sorry you went through that," he said quietly. I took what I could carry and walked until I found San Andreas, she continued. The books I saved were all I had left of our old life. My father had been a scholar before hard times forced us west. He taught me to read and write, to value learning above almost everything. He taught you well, Isaac said. You've built a life here through your skills. That takes courage. It takes stubbornness, Beatrice corrected with a faint smile, and desperation. Maybe those two, Isaac agreed, his thumb absently stroking the back of her hand, but also courage. It was during their 6th week of lessons that Isaac arrived carrying something else alongside his mother's books. This time it was a lantern, brass and glass, already filled with oil. "What's this?" Beatrice asked, confused. "I can't stand thinking of you ruining your eyes over those candles," Isaac said, setting the lantern on her table. "This will give you better light. I've brought extra oil too." "Mr. Xerxes, I can't accept this," Beatrice protested, even as her heart swelled at the gesture. "It's too much." "It's Isaac, please," he said. "And yes, you can. Consider it payment for all the extra time you've spent teaching me. I know I'm not the quickest learner." "You're learning just fine," she argued, "and this is far too generous compensation." Isaac's expression grew serious. "Miss Rothwell, Beatrice, if you'll permit me the familiarity. I've been watching you work yourself to exhaustion. You copy from the moment you wake until you can barely keep your eyes open. This lantern might give you a few more hours of comfort, better light to work by. Please, let me do this small thing." Beatrice looked at the lantern, then at Isaac's earnest face. She realized in that moment that this was about more than just a light source. This was Isaac showing he cared about her well-being, that he saw her as more than just a scribe or a teacher. The recognition of it made her breath catch. "Thank you," she said softly. "This is incredibly kind." His face broke into a smile that transformed his features, making him look younger and unburdened. "You're welcome. Now shall we continue with Wordsworth?" The lantern made an immediate difference in Beatrice's work. The steady, bright light was a revelation after months of straining by candlelight. She found she could work longer without the headaches that had plagued her, and her transcriptions became even more precise. But more than the practical benefits, every time she lit the lantern, she thought of Isaac and the care behind his gift. Their lessons continued, and Isaac's reading improved steadily. He could now work through entire pages with minimal help, and his confidence grew with each session. But Beatrice noticed he often lingered after the lesson was complete, finding excuses to stay a while longer. Sometimes he would help her organize her papers. Other times they would simply talk, their conversations ranging from the mundane details of daily life to deeper philosophies about purpose and meaning. "You ever want more than this?" Isaac asked one evening as they sat by her window, watching the sun paint the mountains purple and gold. "More than what?" Beatrice asked, though she knew what he meant. "This room, copying other people's words. Don't you want to write your own, to have your own life, your own home?" Beatrice was quiet, turning the question over in her mind. "Of course I do," she admitted. "But wanting and having are different things. This life keeps me safe, keeps me fed. It's more than many have." "But is it enough?" Isaac pressed gently. "It has to be," she replied, and there was a finality in her voice that made him drop the subject. But the question haunted her in the days that followed. Was this enough? Had she let fear trap her in this small room, this small life? She had survived the tragedy of the wagon train, had built something from nothing, but had she truly lived since then? The hours of copying, the dim room, the solitary existence, was that really all there was? Isaac must have sensed her inner turmoil because he approached their next lesson with a proposal. "I'd like you to come see my ranch," he said. "Just for an afternoon. I think you'd benefit from some time out of this room, some fresh air and sunlight." "I have work," Beatrice protested, but it sounded weak even to her own ears. "Work that will still be here when you return," Isaac countered. "Please, Beatrice. When was the last time you did something just because you wanted to, not because you needed to?" She could not remember which was answer enough. "All right," she agreed. "One afternoon." The following Sunday, Isaac arrived with a gentle mare already saddled. Beatrice had not ridden since before the wagon train attack, and she felt nervous as Isaac helped her mount. But as they rode out of San Andreas toward the mountains, something in her chest loosened. The spring air was sweet with wildflowers, and the sky stretched endlessly above them, so much bigger than the ceiling of her small room. Isaac's ranch was modest but well-maintained. A sturdy cabin sat in a clearing with a barn and corrals nearby. Cattle grazed in the distance, and she could see two men working among them, Isaac's hired hands. "It's not much," Isaac said, a touch of pride in his voice. "But it's mine. Built most of it myself over the past few years." "It's wonderful," Beatrice said honestly. The cabin was small but solid, with real glass windows and a covered porch. Compared to her rented room, it seemed like a palace. Isaac showed her around the property, introducing her to his hands, Tom and Samuel, who tipped their hats respectfully. They had coffee on the porch, and Isaac talked about his plans for expanding the herd, about his dreams of building this place into something lasting. "Why are you showing me all this?" Beatrice asked, setting down her cup. Isaac met her gaze steadily. "Because I want you to see what's possible. Because I care about you, Beatrice, and I want you to know that there are other ways to live, better ways." Her heart hammered in her chest. "Isaac, I know it's presumptuous," he continued quickly. "We've only known each other a few months. But in that time, you've become the best part of my days. I find myself thinking about you when I'm out on the range, wondering if you're remembering to eat, if you're working too hard. I see potential in you that's being wasted in that dim room, copying other people's thoughts instead of living your own life." "This is my life," Beatrice said, but the words felt hollow. "It's what I know how to do." "It doesn't have to be all you do," Isaac argued. "You're young, Beatrice. You have so much ahead of you. Don't let fear keep you locked away." His words struck deep because they were true. She had been hiding, she realized, not just in the physical space of her room, but in the work itself, in the endless copying that kept her hands busy and her heart numb. She had been so focused on surviving that she had forgotten to consider living. "I don't know how to be anything else," she whispered. Isaac reached over and took her hand. "You don't have to know right now. I just want you to consider that there might be more available to you than you've allowed yourself to imagine." They rode back to town as the sun was setting, and Beatrice's mind churned with everything Isaac had said. That night, instead of immediately beginning her copying work, she stood at her window, the lantern Isaac had given her casting its steady light, and looked out at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. For the first time in 2 years, she let herself want something beyond mere survival. The next few weeks saw a shift in Beatrice and Isaac's relationship. The lessons continued, but now there was an unspoken understanding between them, an acknowledgement of deeper feelings that neither quite dared to name aloud. Isaac's touches lingered longer, his smiles were softer, and Beatrice found herself watching the clock, counting the hours until he would arrive. But alongside this growing affection, practical concerns weighed on Beatrice's mind. Her copying work had been slower lately, partially because she was spending more time with Isaac, and partially because her heart was no longer fully in it. Her meager savings were dwindling, and she worried about how long she could maintain even her simple lifestyle. It was during one of these worried nights, as she struggled to focus on transcribing a legal document, that disaster struck. She had been working for hours, fatigue making her careless. Her elbow knocked over the inkwell, and she grabbed for it instinctively. In the chaos, her sleeve caught the edge of the lantern Isaac had given her, the lantern tipped, oil spilling across the table. For one horrible moment, everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The oil met the paper. The flame found the oil. Fire bloomed across her workspace. Beatrice screamed and grabbed the blanket from her bed, beating at the flames. The documents she had been working on, a week's worth of work, caught and burned. She managed to smother the worst of it before the fire could spread to the building itself, but the damage was done. Her table was scorched, the legal papers destroyed, and several of her precious books damaged by smoke and water from the pitcher she had finally thought to use. She sank to the floor among the ruin, shaking. The cost of replacing the documents, of compensating her client, would take what little money she had left. The books, irreplaceable treasures from her father, were damaged, and the table, her workspace, was nearly destroyed. The landlord, Mr. Peterson, appeared at her door, drawn by the commotion. He surveyed the damage with a grim expression. "You're lucky the whole building didn't go up," he said bluntly. "But this room is damaged. I'll need compensation for repairs, and your rent is going up to cover the risk." "Mr. Peterson, please," Beatrice begged. "It was an accident. I can barely afford the current rent." "Not my problem, Miss Rothwell," he replied coldly. "You have until the end of the week to pay what's owed, or you'll need to find somewhere else to live." After he left, Beatrice sat among the ruins of her small life and wept. She had worked so hard, been so careful, and still it had all fallen apart. She thought about the wagon train, about her father's dreams turning to ash, and wondered if she was cursed to watch everything she built burn away. When Isaac arrived for his lesson the next day, he found her trying to salvage what she could from the damaged books. The sight of the destroyed workspace made him stop in the doorway. "What happened?" he asked, quickly moving to her side. Through tears, Beatrice explained. Isaac listened, his expression growing more troubled with each word. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, then said something that shocked her. "Marry me." Beatrice's head snapped up. "What? Marry me?" Isaac repeated, taking her hands. "I know this isn't how I meant to ask, and you deserve better than a proposal born from disaster. But Beatrice, I've been falling in love with you since the first night I walked into this room. I've been trying to find the courage to speak, and watching you struggle here alone has been agony. Let me help you. Let me give you a home, a life beyond these walls." "You can't marry me out of pity," Beatrice protested, even as her heart raced. "It's not pity," Isaac said firmly. "It's love. I love your intelligence, your dedication, the way you've survived when a lesser person would have given up. I love how you look when you're reading, how patient you are when you teach, how you notice the small beauties in the world even when things are hard. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to build a life together. I want to give you the space and security to figure out who you want to be beyond just surviving." "Isaac, we've only known each other a few months," Beatrice said, but she did not pull her hands away. "My parents knew each other 3 weeks before they married," Isaac replied. "They had 20 good years together before the fever took them. Time isn't what matters. What matters is that I know my heart, and my heart wants you." Beatrice looked around her ruined room, at the damaged books and scorched table, at the dim walls that had been her prison as much as her refuge. Then she looked at Isaac, at his honest eyes and his open expression, at the promise of something more, something better. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Of trusting this, of letting myself hope." "I know," Isaac said gently, "but hope is all we have in the end. Take a chance with me, Beatrice. Let me show you what life can be." She thought of the ranch, of the open sky and the sturdy cabin, of waking to sunlight instead of shadows. She thought of partnership instead of solitude, of being seen and valued beyond what services she could provide. She thought of love, real love, the kind she had read about in books but never expected to experience herself. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Isaac's face transformed with joy. He pulled her into his arms, and she felt safe in a way she had not since her father died. They held each other among the ruins, and it felt like a beginning rather than an ending. The wedding was simple, held at the small church in San Andreas 3 weeks later. Beatrice wore a blue dress that had belonged to Isaac's mother, altered to fit her smaller frame. There were no guests beyond Tom and Samuel, who served as witnesses, and Dr. Harrison, who had become fond of Beatrice through their professional dealings. The ceremony was brief, but when Isaac slipped his mother's ring onto Beatrice's finger and kissed her as his wife, she felt something unlock inside her chest. Moving to the ranch was like entering a new world. The cabin, which had seemed so impressive during her visit, became her home. Isaac had prepared for her arrival by building bookshelves along one wall of the main room, a space for the books she had saved and room for more. "You'll need somewhere to keep your library," he said simply when she asked about them. "My library," Beatrice repeated, confused. "I've been thinking," Isaac said, his expression turning slightly sheepish. "You taught me to read, showed me the value of books and learning. There are others in San Andreas and the surrounding ranches who might benefit from the same. What if you started a lending library? Nothing fancy, just books people could borrow, maybe some teaching for those who want it." "Isaac, books are expensive," Beatrice protested. "We can't afford to just buy a library." "We have some savings," Isaac countered, "and I've been doing well with the cattle. Besides, this wouldn't just be for charity. You could charge a small fee for borrowing, offer your teaching and copying services. It would be a business, one that could grow over time." The idea took root in Beatrice's mind like a seed. A library, a place of learning, something that would honor her father's memory and serve the community. "Do you really think it's possible?" "I think you could do anything you set your mind to," Isaac said, pulling her close. "And I want to help you do it." They started small. Isaac took a portion of their savings and traveled to Santa Fe, where he purchased 24 books from a merchant who was selling off his inventory. He chose carefully, mixing practical volumes about farming and animal husbandry with works of literature and poetry. When he returned with them, Beatrice wept at the sight of so many books, more than she had seen in one place since leaving her father's house. She set up a small notice in the general store in San Andreas, advertising her lending library and services. The response was slow at first. People were skeptical, unsure what use they had for borrowed books. But gradually, word spread. A rancher's wife came seeking a cookbook. A young man wanted to learn to read so he could write to his family back east. A merchant needed help understanding a complex contract. Beatrice worked from home now, no longer confined to that dim room above the store. She had proper light, fresh air, and Isaac's steady presence. The library grew slowly but surely, each new acquisition carefully considered. Isaac never complained about the money spent on books, seeing how Beatrice came alive when she was working with them, teaching others, or simply reading by the fire in the evening. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. Money was tight sometimes, especially when they were building the library. There were difficult days when the cattle were sick or the weather was poor. But through it all they had each other. Isaac taught Beatrice to ride properly, and she would sometimes accompany him when he checked on the herd, a book tucked into her saddlebag to read during rest breaks. She taught him not just to read, but to love reading, and they spent many evenings taking turns reading aloud to each other. It was during one of these evenings, nearly a year after their wedding, that Beatrice shared important news. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky, when she took Isaac's hand and placed it on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said softly. Isaac's eyes widened, then filled with tears. "Truly, truly," Beatrice confirmed. "The baby should come in late autumn." He gathered her into his arms carefully, as if she were suddenly made of glass. "A baby," he repeated wonderingly. "A family." The pregnancy was healthy, though Beatrice found the summer heat oppressive. Isaac was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly worrying about her taking on too much work. But Beatrice continued with the library, finding joy in the growing community it was creating. Women would come to borrow books and stay to talk, sharing recipes and advice. Young people came seeking education and left with expanded horizons. One visitor, in particular, became important to their story. Elena Martinez was the daughter of a rancher who lived about 15 miles from San Andreas. She was 17, bright and curious, and she came to Beatrice seeking books and learning. Her father, she explained, did not see value in education for daughters, but Elena hungered for knowledge. "I want to be more than just someone's wife," Elena confided one afternoon as Beatrice was showing her the latest additions to the library. "I want to understand the world, to maybe be a teacher myself someday." Beatrice saw herself in this young woman, the same hunger for more, the same sense that life could offer greater things than the narrow path laid before her. She began tutoring Elena in earnest, teaching her not just to read better, but mathematics, history, and philosophy. Isaac, seeing the importance of this work, encouraged it fully. As autumn approached and Beatrice's pregnancy advanced, Isaac made preparations for the baby's arrival. He built a cradle from oak wood, smooth and strong. He brought Dr. Harrison out to the ranch to ensure everything was in order. And he hired Elena to help with household tasks and the library work, giving Beatrice time to rest while keeping the young woman from her restrictive home. The baby came on a cool October evening as the first frost touched the mountains. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Isaac feared he might lose her. But Beatrice was strong, stronger than he knew, and as dawn broke over the mountains, their son entered the world with a healthy cry. They named him David, after Beatrice's father. He had Isaac's dark hair and Beatrice's blue eyes, and from the moment Isaac held him, he knew his heart had expanded to hold more love than he thought possible. The weeks after David's birth were a blur of sleepless nights and new routines. Elena proved invaluable, helping with the library and the house while Beatrice recovered. The community rallied around them as well, with neighbors bringing food and offering assistance. It reminded Beatrice that they were no longer alone in the world, but part of something larger. As winter settled in and David grew, Isaac and Beatrice settled into the rhythms of family life. The library continued to grow, with Isaac building additional shelves to accommodate the expanding collection. Word had spread beyond San Andreas, and people sometimes traveled significant distances to access the books or Beatrice's teaching services. It was during the winter that Isaac made another surprising proposal. He had been saving money again, carefully setting aside profits from good cattle sales. One evening, after David had been put to bed and they were sitting by the fire, he brought up his idea. "I want to build a proper library," he said. "Not just shelves in our house, but a real building in town where people can come. You could teach there, lend books, maybe even sell some. It would be a real business, something permanent." Beatrice stared at him. "Isaac, that would cost a fortune." "I've been talking to some of the other ranchers," Isaac explained. A few of them are interested in investing. They've seen how the library has helped their families, their workers. Mr. Peterson, your old landlord, owns an empty building near the general store. He's willing to sell it for a reasonable price if we commit to the project. This is an enormous undertaking, Beatrice said, her mind racing with possibilities and concerns. I know, Isaac agreed. But I believe in it. I believe in you. Think about it, Beatrice. A real library in San Andreas may be the first public library in this part of the territory. Your father would be proud. The mention of her father struck a chord. She thought of his dreams for California, his belief in the power of education and learning. This library could be a way of honoring that, of turning tragedy into something meaningful. Let me think about it, she said finally. Over the following weeks, Beatrice considered the proposal from every angle. She visited the empty building Mr. Peterson owned and saw its potential. She talked to members of the community and gauged their interest. And slowly, she began to believe it was possible. In early spring, they moved forward with the plan. With investments from 3 other ranching families and their own savings, they purchased the building. Isaac and his hands, along with volunteers from town, began the work of transforming it into a proper library. They built sturdy shelves, installed good windows for natural light, and created a space for reading and study. Beatrice meanwhile organized their growing collection, cataloged books, and planned the layout. Elena, now 18 and one of Beatrice's most accomplished students, was hired as an assistant. Dr. Harrison donated several medical texts. The local minister contributed religious volumes, and gradually the library took shape. The grand opening was held on a warm day in May, 2 years after Beatrice and Isaac's wedding. Nearly the entire town turned out, along with families from surrounding ranches. The building gleamed with fresh paint. The shelves were full of books arranged by subject, and comfortable chairs invited people to sit and read. Beatrice gave a short speech, her voice wavering with emotion as she talked about the power of books to change lives, to open minds, to create community. This library belongs to all of us, she concluded. It is a place where anyone can come to learn, to grow, to discover. I hope it will serve this community for generations to come. The applause was genuine and heartfelt. As people filed in to explore the shelves and admire the space, Isaac slipped his arm around Beatrice's waist. "You did it," he said softly. "You built something beautiful." "We did it," Beatrice corrected. "None of this would exist without you." Isaac kissed her temple. "We make a good team." The library thrived. Beatrice kept regular hours, lending books, helping with research, teaching those who wanted to learn. Elena blossomed under the responsibility, developing into a fine teacher herself. The space became a hub for the community, a place where people gathered not just for books, but for connection and conversation. As the years passed, the library's reputation grew beyond San Andreas. People would travel from surrounding towns to visit, and Beatrice began receiving requests for help starting similar libraries elsewhere. She and Isaac would make occasional trips to other communities, sharing their model and offering advice. David grew into a bright, curious child who toddled among the bookshelves and learned his letters before he was 4. When he was 5, Beatrice gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Sarah. She had her mother's blonde hair and a fierce determination that showed itself from infancy. The ranch prospered as well. Isaac's careful management and fair treatment of his workers built a reputation that allowed him to expand his operation. He hired more hands and increased his herd, but he never let the work consume him. Family always came first, and he made sure to be present for his children, reading to them every night just as Beatrice had once read to him. Elena eventually left to attend a teacher's college in Denver, her education paid for in part by the community who had benefited from her work at the library. She wrote regularly, and Beatrice treasured every letter, proud of how far the young woman had come. Time moved forward as it always does. The children grew. The library expanded again, requiring an addition to the building. Isaac's ranch became one of the most successful in the region. But through all the changes, the core of their life remained constant: love, learning, and community. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Isaac surprised Beatrice with a gift that took her breath away. It was a book, but not just any book. This one was bound in fine leather with gilt edges, and when she opened it, she found her name on the title page. The Story of the San Andreas Library by Beatrice Rothwell Xerxes, she read aloud, confused. But I didn't write this. Not yet, Isaac said with a smile. But I thought you might want to. You're always helping other people tell their stories, writing letters for them, copying their documents. Maybe it's time you told your own story, our story. Beatrice ran her fingers over the blank pages, pristine and waiting. I wouldn't know where to start. Start with a girl copying books by candlelight, Isaac suggested. And a cowboy who bought her lanterns because he couldn't stand to see her strain her eyes. She looked up at him, this man who had changed her life so completely, who had seen potential in her when she saw only limitations. And then what? And then everything else, Isaac said. The library, the family, the life we've built. It's a story worth telling, don't you think? Beatrice thought about it, about the journey from that dim room to this full life. About fear and hope, loss and love, endings and beginnings. Yes, she agreed. Yes, I think it is. She did write the book eventually. It took her 3 years of working in spare moments between managing the library and raising her children. She wrote about the wagon train attack and her father's death, about the lonely years in the small room, about Isaac's arrival, and the lanterns he brought into her life, both literal and metaphorical. She wrote about building the library, about the community that had formed around it, about the power of books to transform lives. When it was finished, Isaac arranged to have it printed in Santa Fe. It was a small run, just 50 copies, but those copies spread throughout the territory. Other communities read about the San Andreas Library and were inspired to create their own. Beatrice received letters from women who saw themselves in her story, who found courage in her journey from survival to thriving. By the time David was 12 and Sarah was 7, the San Andreas Library had become something of a legend in the territory. It held over 1,000 books now, one of the largest collections in New Mexico. Beatrice had trained several other librarians who had gone on to start libraries in other towns. The building had been expanded twice to accommodate not just books, but also a small school where Elena, having returned from Denver, taught children whose parents could not afford formal education. Isaac, now 36, had silver threading through his dark hair. The years of ranch work had kept him strong, but he moved a bit slower now, more careful with his back. He still rose before dawn to check on the cattle, still worked alongside his hands during branding season, but he also made sure to be home for dinner every night, to read to Sarah before bed, to help David with his mathematics. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching another sunset paint the mountains, Beatrice reflected on how different her life had become from what she once imagined. "You ever regret it?" she asked Isaac suddenly. "Regret what?" he replied, though he had a feeling he knew what she meant. "All of this. The money you've spent on the library, the time I've spent there instead of here. Some would say a wife should focus on home and family, not running a public institution." Isaac was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. You know what I see when I look at you? He finally said, I see a woman who took tragedy and turned it into purpose. I see someone who could have become bitter and closed off, but instead chose to open herself to love and possibility. I see a brilliant mind that was being wasted in that dim room, and I'm grateful every day that I got to be part of freeing it. He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. You've given me so much, Beatrice. 2 beautiful children, a home full of warmth and love, a life richer than I ever dreamed. And through the library, you've given the whole community something precious. Why would I regret any of that? Because I'm not always here, Beatrice said softly. Because you have to share me with the books and the people who need them. Love isn't a finite resource, Isaac replied. You loving your work doesn't mean you love us less. If anything, I think it makes you love us more because you're fulfilled, you're whole. And our children are learning from you that people can be more than one thing, that women can be wives and mothers and also scholars and leaders. Beatrice leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the tension she had been carrying release. I love you, she said. I don't say it enough, but I do. You saved me, Isaac, not just from that room, but from giving up on life entirely. We saved each other, Isaac corrected gently. I was going through the motions before I met you, just existing from day to day. You gave me purpose beyond the ranch, beyond just making money. You taught me that life is about more than survival. It's about connection, about learning, about building something that matters. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the mountains. Inside the house, they could hear David and Sarah arguing about something, their voices rising and falling. It was a familiar sound, the sound of family, of life being lived. As the years continued to unfold, the Xerxes family became an integral part of San Andreas's fabric. David, showing his father's practical nature combined with his mother's love of learning, talked of becoming a veterinarian. Sarah, fierce and independent, declared she would be a lawyer, one of the first women to practice law in the territory. Isaac and Beatrice encouraged both dreams, knowing that the world was changing and their children would have opportunities that previous generations could barely imagine. The library continued to grow and evolve. When the railroad finally reached San Andreas in 1892, it brought an influx of new residents and new ideas. Beatrice worked with the town council to officially incorporate the library as a public institution, ensuring its future beyond her own stewardship. A board of directors was formed, including Isaac, Dr. Harrison, and several prominent citizens. Funding was established through a combination of membership fees, donations, and eventually a small municipal tax. Elena, who had married a teacher from Denver and returned to San Andreas with her husband, took over more of the day-to-day operations as Beatrice moved into a more advisory role. It was bittersweet, stepping back from something she had built, but Beatrice recognized that the library needed to grow beyond her, to become truly communal rather than dependent on one person. On the 20th anniversary of the library's founding, the town threw a celebration. The event was held in the town square, with speeches and music and food. Beatrice, now 43, stood before the gathered crowd and spoke about the journey. 20 years ago, I was alone in a dim room, copying other people's words because I did not believe I had any words of my own worth sharing, she said. I was surviving, but I was not living. Then a cowboy walked into that room and saw something in me I could not see in myself. He brought light into my darkness, literally and figuratively, and together we built this library. She gestured to the building behind her, which had grown from one room to a substantial structure that dominated the block. But this library is not just about books on shelves. It is about community, about the belief that knowledge should be accessible to everyone regardless of wealth or status. It is about creating opportunity and fostering growth. Every person who has learned to read within these walls, every child who has discovered the joy of stories, every adult who has found the information they needed to improve their life, they are the true measure of our success. The applause was thunderous. People stood, cheering for Beatrice, for Isaac, for the library itself. Looking out at the crowd, Beatrice saw faces she had taught, families who had been transformed by access to books, young people who had gone on to achieve more than their circumstances should have allowed. She saw Dr. Harrison, now elderly but still sharp. She saw Alina with her husband and 3 children. She saw Tom and Samuel, Isaac's loyal ranch hands who had become like family. And most importantly, she saw Isaac, David, and Sarah standing in the front row, their faces glowing with pride. After the speeches concluded and the celebration shifted to music and dancing, Isaac pulled Beatrice aside. They walked to the library's entrance, away from the crowd's noise. "I have something for you," Isaac said, pulling a folded paper from his jacket. Beatrice unfolded it to find a deed. "What is this?" "The old Hartley place about 2 miles from our ranch," Isaac explained. 5 acres with a small house. I bought it 6 months ago." "Why?" Beatrice asked, confused. "For when you want to retire from the library," Isaac said. "Not to stop working, but to have a private space for your own projects. I know you've been talking about writing more, about compiling a history of the territory. I thought you might like a quiet place to work, separate from the ranch house and the library." Beatrice felt tears spring to her eyes. After all these years, Isaac still understood her needs, still found ways to support her dreams. "You're too good to me," she whispered. "Impossible," Isaac replied, kissing her forehead. "You deserve everything good this world has to offer." The years that followed were perhaps the most peaceful of Beatrice's life. David went east to study veterinary medicine, eventually returning to practice in San Andreas and the surrounding ranches. Sarah attended university in Denver, studying law as she had promised, becoming one of the first women admitted to the bar in New Mexico. Both children married and started families of their own, giving Beatrice and Isaac grandchildren to dote on. Beatrice did retire from daily library duties, passing the leadership to Alina and a board of directors. But she remained active, writing several books about territorial history and the development of public libraries in the West. The small house Isaac had bought for her became her writing retreat, a place where she could work in peace while still being close to family. Isaac gradually handed over the ranch operations to David and a younger partner, though he never fully retired. He would still ride out to check the cattle, still got involved during busy seasons, but he also spent more time at home with Beatrice, more time traveling to visit Sarah in Denver, more time simply enjoying the life they had built. On their 30th wedding anniversary, they returned to San Andreas from the ranch house and walked through the town together. So much had changed since that night Isaac had first knocked on Beatrice's door. The town had grown from a rough mining settlement to a proper community with paved streets, electric lights, and regular train service. The library had expanded again and now took up an entire block, with separate sections for children, adults, and a research room for scholars. They walked past the building where Beatrice had once lived in that dim room. It was still there, now converted to apartments for railroad workers. Beatrice paused, looking up at what had been her window. "Do you ever miss it?" Isaac asked, following her gaze. "The room?" "No," Beatrice said immediately. "But sometimes I miss how simple things were, not easy but simple. There was just survival, just the next page to copy, the next candle to light." "Would you go back if you could?" Isaac asked. Beatrice turned to look at him, at this man who had walked into her life and changed everything. His hair was mostly silver now, his face lined by sun and time, but his eyes still held the same warmth, the same steadiness that had first made her trust him. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a moment. You showed me that life could be more than just enduring until it ends. You taught me to hope again, to dream, to believe in possibilities. Everything we've built, everything we've shared, it all started because you cared enough to bring light into my darkness." Isaac pulled her close, and they stood together in the growing dusk, two people who had found each other against long odds and built something lasting. The final years of their lives were gentle ones. They divided time between the ranch and their house in town, surrounded by children and grandchildren. The library thrived under new leadership, with Alina's daughter eventually taking over as head librarian. Beatrice's books were read throughout the territory and beyond, preserving stories and history that might otherwise have been lost. Isaac passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72, surrounded by family. Beatrice held his hand as he took his last breath, whispering words of love and gratitude for the life they had shared. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched through his generosity, his kindness, and his unwavering support for education and community. Beatrice lived another 5 years after Isaac's death. She spent that time writing her final book, a memoir about their life together. She titled it Light in the Darkness, a love story, and it became her most widely read work. In it, she was unflinchingly honest about her struggles, her fears, the trauma of losing her family, and the slow process of learning to trust and love again. She wrote about Isaac with deep affection, describing not just their romance but their partnership. She wrote about the library and how it had changed the community. She wrote about their children and the joy of watching them exceed every expectation. And she wrote about the lesson she had learned from it all, that the darkest moments in life can lead to the brightest futures if we remain open to possibility. Beatrice Rothwell Xerxes passed away on a spring morning, sitting in her writing room at the Hartley place. She had been working on correspondence, answering letters from young women who had read her books and found inspiration in her story. When David came to check on her at noon, he found her at her desk, her pen still in her hand, a peaceful expression on her face. Her funeral was held at the library, the building she had fought so hard to create. The shelves now held over 5,000 books, and the institution served thousands of people each year. In her will, Beatrice left her personal collection of rare books to the library, along with a generous endowment to ensure its continued operation. She also left money for scholarships for young women seeking higher education, particularly those interested in teaching or library work. The town erected a statue in front of the library, depicting Beatrice seated at a desk with a book in her hands. The inscription read, "Beatrice Rothwell Xerxes, 1857–1933. She brought light to the darkness and opened doors to knowledge. Wife, mother, scholar, teacher, friend." Years later, when the library celebrated its 50th anniversary, David and Sarah stood together in the building their mother had created. They looked at the portrait of their parents that hung in the main reading room, a photograph from their 20th wedding anniversary. Isaac's arm was around Beatrice's shoulders, and they were both smiling, happy and together. "You think they knew what they were starting?" Sarah asked her brother. David considered the question, looking around at the crowded library, at the children in the reading room, at the scholars in the research section, at the ordinary people browsing shelves and checking out books. "I think Mother hoped," he said finally. "And I think Father believed in her hope enough to make it real." Sarah nodded, then added softly, "They really loved each other, didn't they? Not just in the romantic sense, but in the way they supported each other's dreams, the way they built something together." "They did," David agreed. "Father always said that loving someone meant helping them become their best self. He certainly did that for Mother, and she did the same for him. He was just a cattleman before they met, but she inspired him to think bigger, to care about things beyond his own success." They stood in silence for a moment, remembering. Then Sarah said, "I hope they knew how much it mattered what they built here, not just the library but the example they set. I don't think I would have had the courage to become a lawyer if I hadn't grown up watching Mother fight to create this place." "They knew," David assured her. "Mother's last letter to me, she wrote about legacy. She said that the measure of a life well lived is not what you accumulate, but what you give and how you love. She felt her life had been rich beyond measure." The library continued long after all who had known Beatrice and Isaac personally had passed away. It weathered depressions and wars, adapted to new technologies, and remained a cornerstone of the San Andreas community. New generations of librarians walked its halls, never knowing the desperate young woman who had once copied books by candlelight in a dim room, never meeting the cowboy who had loved her enough to build her a library. But the light they had kindled continued to burn, illuminating minds and opening possibilities for countless people. And in that way, their love story never truly ended. It lived on in every person who found hope in a book, who discovered their potential through learning, who dared to dream of something more than the limitations their circumstances imposed. The story that began with a flickering candle flame had become an enduring beacon, proof that love and dedication could create something that transcended individual lives, something that would continue to make the world brighter for generations to come. Beatrice had wanted to survive, but Isaac had taught her to thrive. Together, they had created not just a library, but a legacy of light in the darkness that would never fade.